urban planner in San Diego, Los Angeles, and Denver. In addition to ensuring that proposed projects complied with environmental statutes such as the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, Mr. Rogers Wright was also responsible for evaluating the compliance with Executive Order number 12898, Environmental Justice. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings, for this opportunity. It's my hope that you will heed the calls from this talented group of speakers who have traveled to offer you narratives about humanity's greatest challenge, global climate disruption or climate change. Our planet, our climate, our children, and especially frontline communities of color are looking to you all to promulgate a platform that communicates the need for acute, chronic, and radical change. That said, my friends, while climate change affects all of us, it does not affect all of us equally. As preeminent environmental justice scholar and practitioner Dr. Robert Bullard reminds us, frontline low-wealth communities of color are hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, the response of our government to address this disparity is usually past and last. In their seminal work, The Wrong Complexion for Protection, Dr. Beverly Wright and Dr. Bullard remind us environmental and public health threats from natural and human-made disasters are not randomly distributed. Healthy places and healthy people are highly correlated, and it should be no surprise that the poorest of the poor within the United States have the worst health and live in the most degraded and at-risk environments. There is nowhere in the country experiencing this reality more profoundly than the Gulf South region of the United States, and there is no industry that engenders this calamitous condition more so than the fossil fuel industry. It is imperative for the DNC to call for the cessation of all offshore drilling operations, and specifically in the Gulf of Mexico as part of the party platform. Right now, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is considering 5-year leases that will allow big oil companies to access designated areas in the Arctic and the Gulf for deep water oil drilling. While there has been much discussion about the implications of this plan to the Arctic with its polar bears, including letters from Democratic senators to Secretary Jewell and calls from mainstream environmental groups, there has been less attention to the implications of this plan to the Gulf Coast with its low-wealth black and brown people. This despite the fact that of the 13 potential leases, 10 are in the Gulf and only 3 are in the Arctic. This iniquitous transmission of urgency further proves that the Gulf is one of, if not the preferred sacrifice zone of the United States of America. And it further proves why we must, as a global community, cease thinking about climate change solely as a nefarious natural phenomenon. Climate change is also a system of oppression that forms the intersection of racial, economic, gender, indigenous, and ethnic injustice. Hence, addressing climate change will take an intersectional approach. You cannot address climate disruption without addressing disruption to all forms of justice. The Gulf Coast includes the nexus, as we've learned, of Cancer Alley, sinking land, the denial of federal recognition for sovereign tribal nations, and respect and restoration of tribal lands. It also is the home to the first U.S. climate migrants to be, the Biloxi Chickamauga Choctaw tribe, who have lost 98% of their land to the encroaching Gulf waters due largely to oil and gas drilling operations. And all the while, the Gulf Coast still remains one of the poorest and impoverished regions in the country. These are all the variables that contributed to climate change's oppressive equation in the Gulf and vulnerable communities nationwide, including Native communities. Now, while I applaud many of President Obama's and the Democrats' efforts to address climate change, it's still important to distinguish between acknowledging climate change and acting on climate change. And this discrepancy was put on full display last year during the Global COP21 Climate Summit in Paris. My organization was honored to assist students and faculty from the historically black colleges and universities Climate Change Initiative to participate in COP21, because we believed it was important for the stories of the Gulf Coast to be given global attention, and many of the HBCU students and faculty members themselves are residents of the Gulf Coast. But while this was happening and they were offering their narrative to the world, back home the president and fellow Democrats were negotiating lifting the crude oil export ban previously in place since the 1970s. The HBCU students made impassioned pleas by video to Democratic senators declaring the ban must stand, but to no avail. And unfortunately, friends, this communicated to us, and I believe the entire Gulf Coast, that the president and Democrats' calls to address climate change were meretricious and vacuous, because we knew that lifting the ban would lead to more offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So here's an inconvenient truth that I must share with all of you. Climate denial is not limited to GOP boogeymen like Senator James Inhofe and Ted Cruz. Because by allowing the crude oil export ban to be lifted and considering an increase in offshore drilling, Democrats too are denying the science of climate change. The science telling us we must keep 80% of remaining fossil fuels deposits in the ground, and our friends from Oil Change International and Greenpeace inform us that the proposed 5-year offshore leasing program would lead to increased emissions of 850 million metric tons of carbon dioxide over roughly 50 years, which is the equivalent to the emissions from 3.6 million cars on the road over the same period. It was Frederick Douglass who said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." There are no better words that portray the situation in the Gulf Coast. And this is why we are seeing so many take to direct action, risking their freedom, their safety, and their lives to disrupt, divest from, and abolish fossil fuels with the same fervor as Douglass and his allies used to abolish slavery. And it is why our friend and author-journalist Wen Stevenson has called our movement the New Abolitionists. Climate change has pillaged time from all of us, including our time to act. There is no time for half measures, perfunctory proclamations, or policies derived from incrementalism. Climate disruption is a radical system that requires radical action. The Gulf Coast cannot afford another BP blowout, another Shell oil spill, and the people will no longer allow themselves to be captive to a circumference of injustice that continues to rob them of clean air, land, public health, and economic elasticity. And until we cease offshore drilling in the Gulf and the Arctic, the prescient words of Mr. Douglass will be vindicated as communities, regions, nations, and the entire planet will exist in a climate reality bereft of safety. I will leave you with these truths for the DNC as we head into the general election season. According to a poll by our friends Green for All and Van Jones in 2014, 68% of voters of color favor immediate action to address climate change, and a 2014 survey conducted by Benenson Strategy Group informed us that 85% of African Americans support global commitments to act on climate, which is the largest percentage of a demographic group. Benenson also predicted that climate change will be a major issue for our nation's 17.8 million black voters in the 2016 election. And furthermore, according to a study conducted by George Mason and Yale Universities, 82% of Latinos and 89% of African Americans support measures to regulate and reduce carbon emissions. No Democratic candidate for the presidency has won the white vote in this country since 1964 with Lyndon B. Johnson, and the average of white support for Democratic candidates since '72 is 39%. Ergo, the DNC and the Democrats are totally dependent on the participation of people of color for electoral success. The DNC must prove that our health and the health of our communities are as important as our votes. Including an offshore drilling ban in the party platform will be an essential step to demonstrate this. There is only one choice moving forward. Offshore drilling must be replaced with offshore wind, thereby powering a just transition from a fossil fuel economy to a fossil-free future. The fossil fuel empire and their political puppets can no longer use the excuse that renewable energy production is too expensive. Even Bloomberg News, not exactly a progressive bastion of publications, recently concluded the costs of wind and solar are falling too quickly for gas ever to dominate the global scale. As such, the only thing keeping us from a revolutionary and just transition from fossil fuels are lack of political will and abject avarice. A line in the sand has been drawn, and I, like many others, call on the DNC to exercise political valor, stand with the people on our side of the line, stand with our children, and stand with the planet. Write a chapter in U.S. history, write a chapter in world history, and do something epochal by including a call for the cessation of all offshore drilling in the United States as part of the party platform. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I welcome your questions.